Thank you, Dr. Shri Kumar. And of course, I did miss out on your initial remarks because I just came out of another FDP and there was a 5-minute break. But I was happy to hear Dr. Pal and Dr. Vijay Kumar both talking on very close aspects that impact universal literacy and numeracy. And as someone who's been part of the policy making exercise for the National Education Policy 2020, 3.5 years down the line, NEP still seems the elephant in the room. All of us are trying to understand it from different angles and different perspectives, which is tragic. But at the same time, let me come to the main question that you're trying to ask and how we in the policy formulation try to address this. But at the same time, I think I should respond to what Dr. Pal mentioned and Dr. Vijay Kumar also mentioned. The recognition that any assimilation that we do comes in from the most familiar to go into the unfamiliar. And that is the main reason why we recommended that for at least up to grade 3 or grade 5, that we teach in home language or local language. And we use the words like home language and local language and not just the regional language. When you use regional language, what Dr. Pal said, 22 languages listed in the Indian Constitution, we get limited by that. But when we say home language and local language, we may not include that as within a given state syllabi, but the teacher's ability to communicate, to connect to the student becomes very important. But that is one of the most challenging recommendations to implement, because the entire exercise of trying to map the schools and the languages spoken, and since he said 80 kilometers, I don't know, I think it's much closer than that. The language seems to be changing every 20 or 30 kilometers, and therefore, and the dialects also make that language sound very different. So that any language that we speak, the dialect variations do not help the student to understand. Mind you, we're dealing with very tender children who are there at 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, and so on. So when you're looking at the foundational stage, you need to actually start being sensitive to the receiver, which somehow we don't tend to, because we are more thinking in terms of practical considerations from the governmental point of view of implementing something. So that's where the language comes in as a constraint. And on mathematics, basically, like he said, the phobia that has developed because mathematics is seen as purely cognitive and not being seen as creative. And basically, maths is not just cognitive, it is cognitive and creative together. So when he uses pictures or when he uses symbols, he is actually harnessing the creative side of the brain to understand something that is cognitive. Now, this is basically the pedagogical mismatch that is happening. And therefore, what happens is when you see it as cognitive, there is a tendency for memorization. And since you cannot memorize things in mathematics, children tend to fail because we tend to focus on rote learning. So this was just my observation to my earlier two panelists who spoke very passionately about the areas in which they deal with. Now, coming to the policy making, we were like, I was happy to see Dr. Vijay Kumar take up that diagram from the policy. We had a lot of thought on whether we should put that diagram, which showed the black box, and on this side, the orange colored box, which showed the 3 to 6 year olds and 6 to 8 as being two compartmentalized sections. Because our conversation with NIMHANS for the mental health made us realize that empirically the brain development happens, at least 95% of our neural synapses get connected only up to the age of 6. And after 6, it's only that remaining 5%. So like Dr. Vijay Kumar rightly said, no amount of drilling that you do after 8-year-old is there will be able to, because the preparedness to learn and the preparedness to assimilate is there in the neural networks, and that has not got developed. So the reason why you see this huge failure in elementary education, 86 policy mentioned we should have early childhood care and education. 86 policy. We didn't implement that. That was not implemented. And we just went saying that you can have a whole private sector, thanks to that recommendation, started with play schools and preschools and completely actually did things which are not pedagogical. Let me tell you that if you ask a child in a play school in an urban setting, their understanding is a child reciting Jack and Jill went up the hill, or saying 1 to 100, or if not 100, at least up to 20. And the parent and the child and everyone in the preschool being prepared to go for an interview for getting admission to class 1 is a complete tragedy of how we look at preschool education. So the 86 recommendation talked about early childhood care and education, which had to be playway based method, which had to be joyful, which had to be creative, and which had to engage the learner in a manner which did not require any formal things that we use in a class. We did not want anything that is formal in that. Now that not having been done, that whatever our failures have happened with children dropping out from class 1 or class 2 or class 3 and so on, is I would say, a kind of a cascading effect of the inability to tap in children through playway based methods between the ages of 3 to 6. So when they come into class 6, you have a huge learning divide. The so-called well-to-do who went into some sort of play schools came in with some sort of learner preparedness. And those who came in from the bulk of India, which is in the rural areas, from the Anganwadi, did not have exposure to any learning assimilative exercises at all. See, an Anganwadi worker, we have about 16 lakh Anganwadi workers. With all respect to them, under the integrated child development scheme of the Women and Child Development Ministry, it's a scheme for taking care of infant mortality rate, maternal mortality rate, ensuring the nutrition. So health and nutrition, your massive immunization programs of polio and all are taken care of by the Anganwadi system. So they have 3 verticals. They have health, they have nutrition, what is the calorific value of food being given to an expectant mother to a newborn baby in terms of the protein, the carbon. And the third was education. What all can an Anganwadi worker do? So what took the beating? Education. So the Anganwadi worker, though is expected to take care of health, nutrition and education, laid attention because of the emphasis on reducing infant mortality and maternal mortality and the health of a child on the health and the nutrition part. Education did not happen. So all children in India's rural setup, which is a large number, comes into class 1, one which had an exposure to learning, preparedness to learn, not real learning, and another who came from this. So there is a huge learning divide. So how do you expect universal literacy and numeracy when the input into a class 1 is already differentiated in terms of their ability to learn? So you have a teacher who's dealing with a class of maybe 30 or 40, and for that class, that's a large number when you're dealing with that age of 5-year-old and 6-year-old. Here is someone where about more than 50% or 60% of the class are not able to understand the basics of counting or the basics of alphabets and connecting those alphabets also. So that not being there, here is a teacher, like Dr. Pal said, if I were talking to you in German, this is the same impact the learner is having. The learner is listening to something which they can't make head or tail, but they still remain. You know why? Because of our midday meal scheme. Hunger. Hunger drives our children to schools. So they get that one-day meal, that afternoon meal. The parent says, छोटे को भी लेके जाओ, बड़े को भी लेके जाओ, but the child is getting food to eat. So the retention, and midday meal, mind you, did impact retention of children in schools, but no real learning actually happened. Now, this is what the National Education Policy 2020, when it talked about the 4 stages, talked about developmentally age appropriate learning, and said that we need to look at 3 to 8, and we need to look at as foundational and address that huge learning gap which is in literacy and which is in numeracy, and that comes out with your FLN mission, which they call it as Nipun Bharat. Now, the challenge in Nipun Bharat, 3 years down the line, and if you have all your scathing reports, it is because we teachers, and I say that because I consider myself more as a teacher than a policy maker and an administrator, we teachers are limited by what Dr. Vijay Kumar said, कि इतना syllabi, itna curriculum cover karna hai. This is what is being told. So no amount of creativity to children to learn. See, children are natural learners. I think all of us sitting here know that and accept that. They're natural learners. And learning has to be joyful. It has not to be seen as a burden. But the way our schooling systems kill the creativity of the child, kill the ability of the child to independently think, is something different. Now, when you tell a child, for example, in mathematics, to say do, count karo 2, and the child keeps a mouse and keeps a highlighter pen, the idea is he need not have both as highlighters. The idea is, did the person understand that as 2? Now, this part where we are completely demolishing the creative and the inquisitive and the power of curiosity of the child, that is where I think we have missed the bus. And this we are trying to remedy through this school preparation module that we call, and the National Curriculum Framework. I'm sure if all of us over here have read through the National Curriculum Framework for school education, and prior to that, when you want to talk about the foundational stage, the curriculum framework for foundational stage must be read separately from the NCFSC, because that delves more into detail into the developing of capacities and abilities and, you know, the dispositions of the children to various such abilities of reading with understanding, computing and numeracy and so on. These things need not be taught in our conventional way that we do. Which brings me to the point that the challenge over here is our pre-service teacher education. The teachers who come in with a qualification like B.Ed, or even if it is DLED that they do, the curricula that they teach does not allow them to experiment with students in creative ways. So you must allow a teacher to experiment, to innovate. Dr. Vijay Kumar is successful because he is breaking the mold. He is coming out of the conventional way to do things by which the child is able to enjoy learning mathematics. And until we instill that enjoyment in the learning and not look at it as a burden to cover a curricula, the parents are stressed out, the student is stressed out, the ecosystem with all regimentation, we have not been able to unshackle our minds from this regimentation. So here the policy, when we wrote the chapter 4 on new approaches to curricula and pedagogy and to move towards holistic and integrated, it is also understanding the connections between not just the knowledge and the dispositions, but various aspects that go into an understanding of a subject. And that has to come through what we say competencies. We need to unbundle that and the kind of questions that we need to put. Did the student at this stage, so that is what FLN, if you read through the Nipun Bharat, and that is a kind of a guideline which I think is fairly well written, because it gives you a checklist for the teacher, it gives you a checklist for the school administration, it gives you a checklist for the parents, it gives you a checklist for members from the local community, including the panchayat members, because the entire community comes together as a stakeholder in the learning journey of a student. And the primacy of the student as being learner-centric and not using that as a cliche, but actually looking at that. And mind you, even as I talk on this, I am gravely concerned about children with disabilities, those who are differently abled, and not just with physical disabilities, but with learning disabilities. When our well-endowed children are not able to achieve their what we may call as their achievements, then what about children who are having a lot of learning disabilities like dyslexia, or are having that ADHD problems, or even autism, all so-called what we are internationally using, since Dr. Deepa is here, neurodivergent children. These categories of children also we need to address. So the NEP, in a certain sense, as a policy, addressed the challenge of the learning divide at entry level of class 1 through a robust ECCE program with a school preparedness module, and also says that the teacher education program will have teachers prepared through integrated teacher education program, which will be preparing for BA B.Ed or BSc B.Ed or BVoc B.Ed or BCom B.Ed, both for foundational, preparatory, middle and secondary, and not one. So we have categorized it stage wise. Just as you have the 4 stages, you prepare teachers for these 4 stages, so that these elements of creative approaches, of activity based learning, about joy based activities, of actually creating learning environments where very diverse student populations coming in, first generation learners, and understanding the language and relationship to their comprehending abilities, and becoming localized and home language. These are all nuanced approaches that the policy is talking about. But like you said, if you look at only urban settings, if you do not recognize the diversity that we have, and teachers start looking at students as if they were clones of one another, and not recognizing that each one is unique in himself or herself, you will still land up with making universal literacy seeming to be a far off goal. But I'm an optimist, because the Nipun Bharat, the way it is getting implemented, though we said 2027 we will achieve it, we may not achieve it by 2027, but at least up to grade 3 and grade 5, if we achieve the minimum competency levels of reading with understanding and numerical skills, then I think the subsequent learning, which is a building on to this, because the foundation is strong. Once the foundation is strong, the building that subsequent learning that the student has may in all probability become much more easier, and therefore their achievement levels may also start improving. So universalizing literacy and numeracy up to grade 5, if we can achieve that in a very sustained manner through the involvement of parents, teachers, parents also very important, because parents tend to draw their own yardstick. इसको homework ही नहीं मिला है, and homework जो दिया है कुछ बाहर जाके करना है. That kind of mentality has to change. So a lot of advocacy for parents is needed, and we need to start reaching out to them, then the civil society, then the local community, then the local elected member of the panchayat, the entire panchayat, the cluster resource centers, the block resource centers. It has to be a coordinated collective effort to ensure that we achieve universal literacy and numeracy. And mind you, since the curriculum is giving us n number of examples, and I believe it is coming out in other languages also, teachers should be able to be given the right kind of training. Otherwise, I think we will still not make a dent, because if few of us who are educators who read it and who talk at fora of this kind, it's a very elite segment of the people who are listening. Beyond that, it is not percolating at the grassroots level. So you need to start making it known to teachers in local languages, in the languages they understand, so that then they go down into the schools. And that percolation effect right up to people who are working at the CRCs and the BRCs at the block level and the district level and so on becomes very, very critical to achieving it. Otherwise, we can have n number of reports which will show you a problem, but you do not address the root cause of that problem, and which is what we have tried to do in the policy. I think I'll stop over here and listen to the rest of the panelists. And thank you, Dr. Srikumar, for inviting me to this discussion.